My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 34 years old, and for the last 11 years I've worked as a financial analyst for a regional insurance company in Columbus, Ohio. Numbers have always made more sense to me than people. A spreadsheet never pretends something is fair when it isn't. Families sometimes do. The brass house key hanging beside my front door wasn't expensive, but it was the most valuable thing I owned. My grandfather had handed it to me the afternoon I closed on my little 3-bedroom craftsman house. He had polished it until it gleamed and smiled before saying, "A home only belongs to the person who protects its door." After he passed away 18 months later, that key became something I touched every morning before leaving for work, almost like a quiet promise to him. My husband, Daniel, understood why. For 16 weekends straight, he gave up every Saturday and Sunday to help turn that tired old house into somewhere we could finally call ours. He rebuilt the sagging porch by hand. He refinished the oak floors one room at a time. He even spent 3 evenings carefully restoring the original dining room chandelier after finding replacement crystals online for exactly $184.67. Every improvement carried fingerprints instead of shortcuts. By Friday, October 11th, everything was finally finished. The dining table sat beneath the restored chandelier, already set with the white china Daniel's grandmother had given us. Fresh rosemary bread cooled on the kitchen counter, while a pot of tomato basil soup simmered gently on the stove. The house smelled like fresh paint, garlic, and relief. That evening wasn't supposed to be about us. My mother, Linda, had invited the whole family to celebrate her 62nd birthday at Bellamy Steakhouse at exactly 6:30 p.m. She insisted everyone attend because, in her words, family memories matter more than busy schedules. Daniel kissed my forehead before we left. "Tomorrow," he said with a tired smile, "we finally get to enjoy our house instead of working on it." I remember reaching for the brass key before locking the front door. It felt unusually heavy in my hand. At 7:48 p.m., dessert plates had just been placed on the table when my mother slowly stood up, tapped her water glass with a spoon, and smiled as though she were about to announce wonderful news. What she actually said would change every relationship in that room. She looked directly at me and declared, loud enough for every table nearby to hear, "Everyone, I have exciting news. Your brother is moving into Claire's house next month." The restaurant burst into applause before I had spoken a single word. I turned toward Daniel. His fork had stopped halfway to his plate. Across the room, my younger brother Ethan was already smiling like someone who had just been handed a prize he never had to earn. Months later, that same brass key would be lying alone on the polished dining table between my mother and me while neither of us reached for it. What my mother didn't know that night was that her announcement wasn't really the beginning of the story. It was simply the first time she said out loud what our family had been practicing for years. Growing up, we never had assigned roles written on paper, but everyone understood them anyway. Ethan was the one who needed protecting. I was the one expected to adjust. If Ethan forgot a birthday, people laughed and called him absent-minded. If I forgot one, I was told I should have planned better. When he quit 2 different jobs before turning 28, Mom insisted he was finding himself. When I worked through the flu because my team depended on me, she said, "Well, that's what responsible people do." The strange part is that I agreed with her for a long time. When Ethan's transmission failed, I loaned him $3,400 without asking when he'd repay me. When he needed somewhere to stay after a breakup, Daniel and I let him use our guest room for 6 weeks. 6 weeks quietly became almost 3 months before I finally asked him about moving out. Even then, I apologized before bringing it up. Looking back now, I wasn't simply being generous. I was helping maintain a system where my boundaries were always considered negotiable. Daniel noticed it years before I did. Whenever we hosted family dinners, he'd polish the brass house key with the edge of a dish towel before hanging it back beside the front door. It became our silent ritual. He never explained why, and I never asked. Somehow, we both understood what it represented. Ownership. Responsibility. Choice. My mother saw something different whenever she looked at our home. She saw another family resource. A place that could solve Ethan's latest problem. The week before her birthday dinner, she had visited for coffee. As she admired the newly finished living room, she casually looked toward the upstairs hallway and asked, "You still have both spare bedrooms?" I smiled. "We do, but one is becoming my office next month." She nodded, almost absent-mindedly, then waved a hand. "We'll see." Those two words barely registered at the time. Now I realize they were never a suggestion. They were a preview. Even worse, I wasn't innocent in any of this. Every time I stayed quiet to keep family dinners peaceful, every time I absorbed another unfair expectation because arguing felt exhausting, every time I accepted being called the dependable one instead of an equal, I helped teach everyone, including myself, that my life was available whenever someone else wanted a piece of it. By the time dessert arrived at Bellamy Steakhouse, my mother wasn't making a shocking decision. She believed she was announcing one that had already been approved. And judging by the smiles around the table, almost everyone else believed it too. For a few seconds after my mother's announcement, the only sound I could hear was the clinking of silverware from nearby tables. Then people started congratulating Ethan. My Aunt Susan smiled across the table and said, "That's wonderful. It'll give him a chance to get back on his feet." My cousin Mark laughed. "Claire's always been the generous one." Daniel slowly turned toward me, waiting for me to speak first. He knew me well enough to recognize the expression on my face. I wasn't angry yet. I was trying to understand whether I had somehow missed an entire conversation. "I don't remember agreeing to that," I finally said. The room went strangely quiet. My mother's smile never faded. "Oh, sweetheart," she replied, brushing invisible crumbs from the tablecloth. "We'll figure out the details later." Then she looked directly at Ethan before repeating the sentence I had heard my entire adult life. Asterisk asterisk family comes first. Asterisk asterisk. There it was. Not a request. Not even an opinion. A verdict. I looked at Ethan, hoping he would interrupt and admit there had been some misunderstanding. Instead, he pulled out his phone. "I've already been measuring furniture," he said casually. "Your upstairs bedroom is perfect. I'll only need to move the treadmill into the garage." My stomach dropped. He wasn't imagining this. He had been planning it. Daniel quietly asked, "Who gave you permission to measure our house?" Ethan shrugged as though the answer were obvious. "Mom said it was basically settled." Basically settled. Those two words landed harder than the announcement itself. I suddenly remembered Linda insisting that Ethan come with her during that coffee visit the previous week. She had said he just wanted to see the renovations. He hadn't been admiring the renovations. He had been inspecting his future bedroom. At exactly 8:03 p.m., my phone buzzed beneath the table. It was a message from Ethan. "Can't wait. Thanks again. I'll start bringing boxes next Saturday. Asterisk asterisk." There wasn't even a question mark. No, would it be okay? Just certainty. Across the table, the birthday cake had just been placed in front of my mother. 24 tiny candles reflected in the polished crystal chandelier while everyone began singing. The finished home Daniel had spent 4 months rebuilding filled my thoughts. The restored porch. The freshly painted office. The guest room we'd planned to turn into a nursery someday. Everything we'd worked for suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else's expectations. I stared at my phone and typed my first response. "Absolutely not. Have you all completely lost your minds? Asterisk asterisk." I read it twice. Then I erased every word. A second draft followed. "If anyone shows up at my house with boxes, I'll call the police." I deleted that one too. Anger was honest. But honesty delivered in anger would become the only thing anyone remembered. Across the table, my mother cut the first slice of birthday cake, looked at me with complete confidence, and smiled again. "Family comes first," she repeated softly, as if the conversation were already over. In that moment, I realized the real battle wasn't about a spare bedroom. It was about whether the brass key in my pocket still belonged to me, or whether everyone else believed they already owned the door it unlocked. That night, Daniel and I drove home in almost complete silence. The only sound inside the car was the steady click of the turn signal as we pulled into our driveway at 9:14 p.m. I unlocked the front door with my grandfather's brass key and stood in the entryway longer than usual. Daniel took off his jacket, looked around the house we had spent 16 weekends rebuilding, and finally asked the question neither of us had been willing to ask in the restaurant. "What do you want, Claire?" Not what my mother wanted. Not what Ethan expected. Not what would keep the peace. What did I want? For the first time in years, I answered without apologizing. "I want this house to stay ours." Daniel nodded once. "Then that's exactly what's going to happen." The next morning at 8:27 a.m., I drafted 3 different text messages to my mother. The first one was fueled entirely by hurt. "You embarrassed me in front of 30 people because you thought you could volunteer my home without asking." I deleted it. The second was even harsher. "If Ethan arrives with a single moving box, he'll be leaving with the police." Delete. Neither message solved anything. After making coffee, I sat at our dining table beneath the restored chandelier, rested the brass key beside my phone, and wrote one final message. "Mom, Ethan will not be moving into our house. That decision was never yours to make. Daniel and I are happy to help him find an apartment, contribute toward his security deposit, and spend this weekend helping him move into a place of his own. But our home is not available. I hope you'll respect that. ****. I read it twice. Then I press send at exactly 8:46 a.m. Her reply arrived 4 minutes later. Only 3 words. "You'll regret this." No questions. No discussion. Just another attempt to make guilt do the work that respect never had. For nearly 3 weeks, my phone stayed unusually quiet. A few relatives stopped responding to my messages. Aunt Susan left a voicemail telling me not to turn one misunderstanding into a family division. My cousin Mark suggested I should simply let Ethan stay for a few months. But something unexpected happened. Daniel's older sister invited us to Thanksgiving instead. Our neighbors brought homemade pie. His widowed Aunt Margaret arrived carrying a dented roasting pan and enough stories to keep everyone laughing until nearly midnight. The table wasn't elegant. Nothing matched. One chair wobbled every time someone leaned back. It was the warmest family dinner I had ever attended. A week later, I learned from Mark that my mother's perfectly planned holiday gathering had been unusually quiet. Ethan had eventually rented a small apartment only 12 minutes from his new job after accepting help from a coworker instead of relying on family. For the first time in years, he was paying his own bills and making his own decisions. 6 months later, my mother appeared at our front door without calling. I didn't rush to answer. I finished washing the coffee mug already in my hands before unlocking the door. She wasn't crying. She simply looked tired. For the first time I could remember, she asked instead of demanded. "Can we talk?" We did. The most important conversation wasn't the one she had with me. It happened privately between her and Ethan later that afternoon. I never asked what either of them said. I only noticed that when they came back into the living room, something heavy had finally been put down. Today, the first Sunday of every month belongs to whoever volunteers to host dinner. Everyone brings a dish. Nobody assigns seats. Nobody announces decisions for anyone else. Last month, Ethan handed me a housewarming invitation for the townhouse he had just purchased. Before he left, my mother quietly picked up my grandfather's brass key from the hallway table, smiled at its worn edges, and placed it carefully back into my palm without saying a word. She didn't need to. Some lessons are stronger in silence. Because I finally learned that protecting the door to your own home isn't rejecting your family. It's teaching them that love never gives anyone the right to walk through without knocking first.